Hello. Today we're going to do a general introduction to what's called the 10 Commandments, the Decalogue, or the 10 Words. Basically, it's the ancient Hebrew law code, the core of it, given to Moses on Mount Sinai. And some would ask, why should we spend time on an ancient Jewish law code? First of all, it's 2,000 years old, and besides, it's Jewish, not Christian. It deals with a culture that's different from ours. It deals with things that we have chosen to change, like instead of the Sabbath, we worship on Sunday. There are many questions about the relevance of the 10 Commandments and exactly their purpose. But I think as we look at this and struggle with some of these relational questions, I'm not sure we can come to a consensus, but maybe we can look under the right rock and see if we can find some insight for our lives. It is true they are an ancient law code, and they have much in common with the cultural and social milieu of their own day. And yet, because they are in the body of written text that we believe is uniquely inspired by God, and feel like that somehow they are uniquely authoritative. They uniquely reveal the character and purpose for God. They become uniquely relevant. Not relevant for how man is right with God, as Galatians 3 shows, but relevant for how man is to relate to God, and then how man is relate to his fellow man because he knows God. It shows something of the Creator for his creation. So I would say this is basically a revelation of Elohim. And then when we come to Galatians 3, we see how Yahweh is going to redeem man spiritually. I'm going to use my notes a bit more thoroughly in this lesson because I want to make sure I cover this point by point. And so I hope you'll follow with me. Your outline is made available to you. If you don't get an outline, if you'll just write us, we'll show you how you can get that. And I think going through this introduction a little more systematically might lock down some of the questions. I'm going to be using several authors and books, and I'll probably show you them in the next few lessons when we get into the text itself. But there are some tremendous resources available, but it's not so much exegetical here because the words are very brief. It's more philosophical and relational and cultural insights that these books bring. First of all, what should we call this? The 10 Commandments, the 10 Words, the Decalogue. Well, in Hebrew, it's the 10 Words. And we see that from several passages. Exodus 34:28, where the 10 laws are referred to earlier back in Exodus 20. Deuteronomy 4:13, and Deuteronomy 10:4. Now, in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, written somewhere around 250 BC for the library at Alexandria, Egypt, and this, of course, is the translation that impacted the early church. Most of the quotes in the New Testament are from the Septuagint. It's called the Decalogue. The word deca in Greek for 10, and logos meaning the words in the accusative sense. So decalogos, and when it came through Latin, it came to us as Decalogue. Now this was also picked up by Clement of Alexandria. He's the first one to really use this phrase in this unique characteristic sense. And following Clement of Alexandria, most of the early church fathers picked up this title to refer to the 10 Commandments as the Decalogue. It goes by several other names or designations in the Bible. When it's obvious it's referring to the 10 Commandments, it calls it other things, particularly two. Number one, it calls it the covenant. And you might want to see Exodus 34:28, and Deuteronomy 4:13, and Deuteronomy 9:9. Now, the etymology of the word covenant is somewhat in dispute. There are three primary possibilities. From the word to eat, meaning there was an animal killed in a covenant meal and that kind of thing. From the word to bind, which means that we're binding somebody together in agreement, two parties. Or from the Hebrew word berit, between. And the most common etymology is berit, covenant, between two people. Which it is, I'm not sure. Besides covenant, it's also called the testimonies. You might want to see Exodus 25:16. In Psalm 19, beginning at about verse 6 or 7, there is a series of poetic parallels where many different words are used to describe the Torah, or the law of God. And so you see how many Hebrew synonyms are basically available for the word covenant or law or teachings or commandments or precepts. And so there was a wide variety of terms to call this agreement, this special relationship, this mutual obligation, friendship bond between God and His covenant people. And that moves me to Roman numeral number 2 in my outline, which is called purpose. And A under that is, the reason these are relevant for us today, thousands of years later, under a different covenant, in a different day, is because these words uniquely reveal the heart, the purpose, and the character of God. For the Ten Commandments basically break into 3 commandments about who God is, and 6 commandments about the significance of people in light of knowing God. And so they're basically guidelines for man's spiritual life as far as how they relate to God, and then guidelines for society on how men are relate to one another. And that is eternally relevant because God hasn't changed, and God help us, the basic fallen nature of man hasn't changed, whether he be on Tahiti in the 6th century, in Cairo at the 12th century, or in America in the 20th century. Now, under that, I also think it shows us something very significant. Not only the purpose and plan and heart of God, but it shows us that the only true God, the Creator, Redeemer God, is an ethical, moral God. A God that has structured His universe with moral implications. A God that's concerned about justice. And we learn from other parts of the amplified Ten Commandments, the book of the law which follows it, that He is uniquely concerned with the poor, the outcast, the socially ostracized, the needy, the helpless, as He is for His covenant people. And I think that's extremely significant. There's been much discussion about, are the Ten Commandments God's guideline for all men? Yes, that is true because there is one God and there is one creation and He has a purpose for all His creation. Yes, they are guidelines for all men. But they are uniquely guidelines for God's covenant people. We must not extrapolate these into a universal realm until we recognize that the context demands a relationship with God. It is somewhat ridiculous to bring a man who does not know of the spiritual realm and try to convince him of a moral God when he doesn't believe in deity. I think a commitment to personal relationship with God precedes the ultimate significance of the Ten Commandments. Though I want to say to you that I think C.S. Lewis has shown so clearly in some of his writings that this inner moral witness, this divine conscience placed in man at creation, which Paul makes allusion to in Romans chapter 1, verses 19 and 20, and Romans 2, 14 and 15, to some extent reflects the basic nature of the Ten Commandments. There are some things that are inherently right and wrong in most primitive cultures that we have ever found. Anthropologists confer with that. The Ten Commandments, in my opinion, reflect these universals. But the only way to demand of man that he follow them is that he knows the God who calls him into a moral sphere. Roy Honeycutt, in one of his excellent little books on the 10 words, says, "The chosen people only are the focus of these commandments." One of my professors at Southwestern Seminary that I always appreciated so much, Huey, says this in his little commentary on Exodus: principles that operate in all human situations. And yet he adds to that, because they deal with the most basic moral principles that govern human relationships, they are universal in scope and applicable to all people of all ages and whatever cultural background. No individual or society is better off by ignoring them. So you hear where Honeycutt says the covenant people only, and Huey would say they're for all people. And I think that there's certainly an element of truth for both. In a Bible commentary edited by Cook, the author of the Exodus section says this: as the divine testimony against the sinful tendencies in man in all ages. You catch the universal nature of that? In man. It's God's way of bringing man. It's like what Jesus did in the Sermon on the Mount. It reveals man's sinfulness and draws us to God. I think that's true. And then C.S. Lewis has put, the inner moral sense, even among primitive tribes, are reflected here. And I think that's very true. C under this, I want to talk about ancient law codes in general. And I'm going to give you several of those in just a minute under the historical background. But I want to mention to you that all of these ancient law codes, of which the Ten Commandments has great affinity as far as form, not content so much, but form, are basically an attempt to regulate and control interpersonal relationships. And number two, they are to give stability and maintain stability in society. Now that's true whether we're talking about the Code of Hammurabi, the Ten Commandments, or the Egyptian moral guidelines. They are meant to give some guidelines for how men are to live with one another, and if we can get peace among men, we're going to have a stable society. A very good and excellent commentary on Exodus by B.C. Childs, it's in a special library series on Exodus, makes this comment. I want to read it. I thought it was so good. The 8 negative aspects show the outer limits of the covenant boundary. There are no misdemeanors. That means you break one of these, you die. No misdemeanors, all capital offenses. But to break the very fabric of which the divine human relationship consists. The 2 positive aspects show the definition of the life within the covenant. The Decalogue looks both outward and inward. It guards against the way of death and points to the way of life. That's in page 398 of that textbook on Exodus. Isn't that beautiful? It shows us the outer boundaries of God's will and gives us the basic constituency of the life of the covenant. I think that's what this does. You know, people see God as just making rules and trying to stop their freedom and cut their party short and rain on their parade. But friends, God has given us some guidelines where we won't walk on each other's freedom. He's given us some guidelines where inside we can have joy and happiness and a peaceful, stable society among other men. The 10 Commandments are a guideline of God's love to fallen man, that fallen man won't walk on one another. And so I think they're only given in the sinful context of man's rebellion. They're given out of God's love, not out of God's killjoyism. I think God's got a bad rap. I want to mention now, under Roman number 3, some other ancient parallels that you might want to look up. And you say, well, Bob, how would I look up other ancient parallels? Well, I'm glad you asked. There are 2 excellent books on that. The Ancient Near East, this is volume 1 by James Pritchard, has translated in English all of the ancient archaeological texts that have been found from all the different sources, Sumerian, Babylonian, Akkadian, Assyrian. It's wonderful. And here's another book called Documents from Old Testament Times by Winton Thomas that does the same thing, but even will cross-reference parallels in the Bible. These 2 books will make available to the normal English reader these ancient law codes and text. Now, the 10 words are found both in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. They're slightly different, particularly in the 4th and 5th and 10th commandments or verses there. The reason for that is that Exodus is a Mount Sinai experience, but Deuteronomy 5 is Moses reinterpreting these for them about to enter the promised land, from a nomadic existence to a settled existence. That has made many commentators say that both of these are not the original form. They are originally very sharp commands to which the Hebrews, under inspiration, modified them under Moses to a nomadic existence and a settled existence. And I think we can see some of that implication in these 2 law codes, and there may be a real truth there. However, the uniformity of these 2 different accounts shows that they have a basic unity and give man some guidelines. They were publicly read periodically and reaffirmed. Joshua 24 shows a good example of this after they got in the Promised Land. Now here's the other law codes that we found. We found one at Ur called Ur-Nemu, which is a Sumerian, about 2050 BC from the city of Ur. We found one called Lipit Ishtar, and it's a Sumerian, about 1900 BC from the city of Isin. And then we found Ishnuna, which is Akkadian, from about 1875 BC from the city of Ishnuna. And then, of course, the very famous one, the Code of Hammurabi, which is Babylonian, about 1690 BC from Babylon. But the stela on which it is written was found in Susa, the Persian capital. Many of the laws in Exodus 20, verse 18, through Exodus 23, 37, often called the Law Code, has much in common with these other ancient law codes. But the Ten Commandments is somewhat different. The Ten Commandments, we've learned from a man named Alt, A-L-T, that he has seen two different forms in this. One is a very sharp, second-person singular command imperative. That's very similar to the Ten Commandments. We don't find those in other cultures. The other cultures more reflect an if-then kind of structure. If you do this, then this will happen. Now, it seems to most commentators that the commands were original and the if-then were application of the original core commands. And I think I certainly agree with that. But I guess the closest affinity that the Ten Commandments has to anything is none of these ancient law codes that I've mentioned, but to the Hittite suzerain treaties that we found in the Nuzi tablets. The Hittite civilization around 2000 BC had a set pattern, a set form of where certain events are happening. When we get into the Ten Commandments themselves, I'll show you this form. This form can be seen both in the entire book of Deuteronomy and in Joshua 24, as well as the Ten Commandments. I thought it might be helpful to give you some, at this point, a summary of the different forms of these suzerain Hittite treaties. I think when I read them, you'll see how the Ten Commandments falls in. Number one, identification of the king. Number two, narration of his great acts. Number three, the covenant obligations. Number four, instructions for depositing the treaty in the sanctuary for public reading. Number five, the deities of the parties invoked as witnesses. And number six, blessings for fidelity and curses for violations. And you can see how that pattern is in the Ten Commandments, though the content is quite different and unique. It's not polytheistic, it's monotheistic. It's very moral, and I think that's very true. Now I want to list quickly four sources that if you're really interested in this and these relationships of the farm to the ancient Near East, here's the books you ought to get. And probably the best would be the one by George Mendenhall called Law and Covenant in Israel and the Ancient Near East. Another one be by Dewey Beagle. It'd be Moses, the servant of Yahweh. And then another one would be W. Bylin, B-E-Y-L-A-L-I-N, Origin and History of the Oldest Sinaitic Tradition. And finally, D.J. McCarthy, which would be Treaty and Covenant. Now, I think we can see some unique internal structure in the Ten Commandments. First, they're all second-person singular, which means God is talking directly to the individual. Now, primarily in the Old Testament, it's corporate. But here, the individual focus is brought into. Now, it's either God's people seen as a corporate entity, or it's every individual within the covenant. And I think both are true. Everyone must respond to God by faith. And here's some guidelines on how to do that. Another excellent book that's going to mention here, and this is Roland DeVoe. Boy, this is paperback. It's in 2 volumes. It's very indexed. You'll love this in your study of the Old Testament. Roland DeVoe, Social Institutions. And he says this, that this second person command, singular form, it has been found in several different of these ancient documents, like the Hittites, always in a sacred context, while the other if-then structure is always found in a secular context. So the Code of Hammurabi, being secular, be one way, but these Hittite suzerain treaties brought in the gods and would be sometimes another way. Now, the 10 words are primarily negative, that outer boundary thing. But there are 2 positive ones that show us the nature of the God which we serve. Now, there's 2 tablets of stone are mentioned, Exodus 24:12, Exodus 31:18. and it's been said that one half meant how God relates to man, and the other half how man relates to God. But it's 3 and 6 is how it's usually divided up, and that's not the same number of letters. I personally believe, based on the Nuzi tablets, the Hittite treaties, that there were 2 separate copies, one to be placed in the Ark of the Covenant, the other to be read. And so I think historically I wouldn't say that one tablet contained half and the other tablet contained half, but that each contained the full copy of the 10 laws. Now, I think that fits historically better. Now, it's amazing to me that there have been different ways of numbering these 10 words, these 10 laws. The Jews believe that Exodus 22 is the first commandment. And to keep the number 10, they make verses 3 through 6 the second commandment. Now, Roman Catholics and Lutherans, following Augustine, make Exodus 20, verses 3 through 6 the first commandment. But in order to keep it the number 10, they divide verse 17 in half and make it 2. The Reformed churches, following Origen and many of the early Eastern churches, the early Western church, as well as the ancient Jewish tradition found in Philo and Josephus, pretty much make Exodus 23 the first commandment, and it seems that the lo in Hebrew designates every different one of the 8, and that seems to me to fit better. So I would start with verse 3 as the first commandment. How are Christians to relate to the 10 commandments? That's a good question. Well, it's obvious that Jesus had a tremendously high view of the Old Testament. You might want to see his sentence on Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, verses 17 and following, where he says, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but not a jot or a tittle will pass away from the law until all is fulfilled." He had a tremendously high view. But in that same context, he began to reinterpret the 10 commandments. He said, "You have heard it said, but I say unto you." He showed that the 10 commandments are eternal, but man's interpretation varies. And so with Jesus writing to the believers of that day shows us that I think the 10 commandments are relevant for the modern Christian. But they are not relevant in the sense of bringing man to a salvation experience or keeping them as a way of being right with God. But they are apparently God's guidelines for us in society, be it the church or a secular society. Now I want to go back to some of these men I've quoted earlier and show you how they differ on this. Some say these commandments relate to all men. Now here's Roy Honeycutt. We never outgrow the 10 commandments because we never outgrow God. Here's another one, Roy Honeycutt. Because the 10 commandments are witnesses to God, however, there is a sense in which their relevance and the relevance of God is so intertwined as to be almost inseparable. Consequently, if God is relevant for your life, the 10 commandments will also be deeply relevant, for they are the written expression of God's character and demands. Here's Roy Honeycutt one more time. Those who are willing to scale the ascending scope of Sinai are ascended, that God will meet them there, speaking once again to those who listen with ears of faith. Now see, he switched gears. The first 2 have said that they're universal for all men, but the last one says you got to listen with ears of faith. And that's what I think. The 10 commandments to be relevant must be in a context of faith commitment to the eternal God. Just to say these are moral guidelines and anybody who does them will be blessed, I think is going beyond what we can say. Personally, I see them in this relationship, and they cannot be divorced from a faith commitment with God. Therefore, for me, they are primarily for those who are in relationship with God. Although, I think because of the inner moral witness that Paul talks about in Romans 1, 19 and 20, Romans 2, 14 and 15, there is an eternal relevance. Now, some say it's for all men and all society at all times. Listen to Elton Trueblood, The Foundations for Reconstruction. The thesis of this small book is that the recovery of the moral law, as represented by the Hebrew Decalogue, is one of the ways in which an antidote to the potential decline of society can be found. Now, he's saying if we regain these moral precepts, we can save secular society. I'm not sure that's true. Now, here's George Rawlinson in the Pulpit Commentary. They constitute for all times a condensed summary of the human duty which bears divinity upon its face, which is suited for every form of human society, and which, so long as the world endures, cannot become antiquated. You hear what he's saying? It's universal. The retention of the Decalogue as the best summary of the moral law by Christian communities, is justified on these grounds and itself furnishes emphatic testimony to the excellence of this compendium. I think that's true, but I want to add this thought. Let me read it and then I'll summarize. It must be stressed that as a means of salvation, they are not, nor ever have been, God's means for the spiritual redemption of fallen man. This is clearly explicated by Paul in Galatians 2:15 through 4:31 and Romans 3:21 through 6:23. They do serve as qualities or guidelines for man in society. They point to God and to how to relate to our fellow man. Can't read my own writing. To miss the first element is to miss everything. Moral rules without changed, indwelt hearts are a picture of man's hopeless fallenness. The 10 words are valid, but only as a preparation to meet God in the midst of our inability. They are guidelines without a guide if divorced from redemption. And by that I mean, knowing the God of the 10 Commandments is a prerequisite to the 10 Commandments bringing a sense of wholeness, happiness, and stability to society. Though I'm not denying they have a moral relevance for all men, I am saying that man can't keep these. Man can't respond appropriately unless the indwelling Holy Spirit makes him a new heart. And you can see that in Jeremiah 31 through 33, and Ezekiel 18. I've really enjoyed being with you. Next week I'll have more time and I'll show you the books that I think are relevant on this subject, and we'll get into the text itself. May God bless you in the study of these Old Testament, and may they not just give you more facts, but help you know how to live more appropriately in the society in which God has placed you. In Jesus' name, have a good day.